welcome to the Classy Liberal podcast. I'm your host, Classy Liberal.
And I am your co-host, Classy Osvaldo.
All right, cool. So, how would you define race realism in your own words?
It's just it's kind of defined in a negative, I guess. It's the repudiation of the idea that the different races have, on average, equal cognitive capacities, and that they have important differences, which affect, which act as powerful social variables that would need to be considered rather than totally ignored, which is kind of what we do now.
Okay, but would you say you're also in the camp that would argue that races could be classified as subspecies?
Not really, just because I always thought that was kind of. I mean, I guess you could make the argument, but I never really thought it was necessary, so I don't really do it.
Okay, so you would say that race is biological then? It's a
Yeah.
biological phenomenon.
I mean, you can argue like race is an arbitrary categorization scheme, but it still describes real biological differences. So yeah, it's biological.
Okay, so many people are not race realists because, for one, race is sort of a very taboo subject, but a lot of them would argue that the science doesn't actually support race realism. For example, many people point to the fact that the Human Genome Project, the one of the most expensive projects ever done in the field of genetics that ended in 2003, basically concluded that, there's no such thing as race, at least when it comes to
Okay, well,
biology.
that wasn't the project. That was the opinion of one of the researchers, and his argument was just that the variation was too small to really count, which is a bit of a silly argument because in biology you often deal with very small variations. Um, it's kind of this argument that it can't be true because it seems unbelievable to me, but the evidence that we have does suggest there are average psychometric differences between the races. And what's telling, I always point this out when I debate the subject, is there isn't really good positive evidence that the races have the same psychometric potential. What I mean by that is people who argue the races are all equal in the brain, they always try to criticize the evidence race realists have. I mean, that's what Kraut did. Towards the end, he was saying any evidence that wasn't molecular genetic evidence doesn't count. Well, I mean, you can say that, but what's glaring is the lack of evidence for your position. And despite the fact that all of the academia wants to believe your position, they still can't scrounge up powerful positive evidence in favor of it. So I think
Sure.
it's ultimately what it comes down to is the evidence suggests race realism. I mean, the specific claims of race realism might end up being wrong. I mean, like, for example, alt-height claims the black-white IQ gap is 80% heritable. It might be only 60%. But still, the broad strokes is race realism is well supported.
Okay, but many people argue that there what do you say differences in terms of how the races interact, intelligence and intellectual capacity, and how they work in societies, that could be explained through environmental factors. For example, some people argue that in the United States, many African Americans have been exposed to lead poisoning, and that could affect their IQ,
Okay.
right?
Well, yes,
There's
but
also there's work on this.
yeah, there's two problems with that. One is the general heritability of intelligence in the United States is very high. It's at 80%. That's a common consensus number. Some say 75, some say 70, but 80% seems to be around where it is. The United States is a rather diverse country, so when the general intelligence has an heritability of that high, it makes it unlikely that significant environmental factors affect the racial gaps. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's improbable. And as for lead specifically, it is true that lead exposure does decrease IQ, and it is true blacks are exposed to it more. But since the 1970s or 80s, the difference between the average black's exposure to lead and the average white's exposure to lead is much, much smaller. It's actually incredibly small and not enough to even make 1 point difference in IQ. Now, there are places like Baltimore where the lead problem is really bad, or Flint, Michigan, where the lead problem is really bad. And with those places, yeah, I definitely think lead poisoning plays a role in their low test scores. But on the whole, lead poisoning does not produce a credible explanation for the total black-white IQ gap.
And what about malnutrition?
Malnutrition? Well, I mean, I don't know much about that, but the thing is that even it's very hard for even poor people in the United States to be malnourished. I mean, I guess I'd have to see evidence that they are significantly malnourished first.
Well, like I guess like in Africa,
Oh, in Africa,
malnourishment.
yeah, Africa, yeah, environmental factors are a lot bigger in Africa because exactly as you said, Africa has a lot less stable access to food, fewer institutions, a lot more people living very, very squalid rural life or very squalid urban life. And yeah, that's why the Black African IQ is significantly lower than the Black American IQ. And yeah, definitely an Africa environment plays a bigger factor. What convinced me of race realism was the state of the state of the arguments for egalitarianism. And what I mean is the arguments for genetic egalitarianism are extremely bad and extremely, I would say dishonest, but I guess extremely picky. What it comes down to is, like I said, they have no positive evidence for their case. They have no study that says, hey, this suggests that if we fix this environmental factor, blacks have an IQ of 99, which is only 1 point away from the white IQ. So environmental determinism is perfectly valid. You know, they have nothing like that. What they have is they criticize the studies put out by race realists for not being good enough, which is, I mean, yeah, I guess you could say that. First of all, a lot of the cases, the studies are good enough. They're just saying they're not good enough. They're making a specious argument in that regard. Like they criticize twin studies, even though twin studies are aware of their own limitations and do things to get more accurate results. But what it comes down to is they always say that you need more evidence. You always need more. You always need more. This is what Kraut tried when he said social science evidence, even if it's quantitative social science, that doesn't count. You have to have molecular evidence. Oh, there's no molecular evidence that confirms your position. Therefore, race realism is wrong and my position is correct, which is ludicrous because there's also no molecular evidence that affirms his position that it's all environmental. And so what I'm just trying to point out to you is be suspicious of arguments which just seem like they're trying to ring race realists up on technicalities rather than actually argue for their own position. And that's all I wanted to say.
Fair enough, fair enough. But my question for you is this, and
Okay.
for you is this: if this race realism stuff is sort of reality, is it is a reality of the current situation? Why is it that it's hard to find a biologist or a geneticist that supports this? Like, I'm not saying there aren't. I'm not saying they don't exist. But like, if I were to open a biology textbook, and I were to go to the page on human evolution or whatever genetics, like I'm not gonna find any say on this. In fact, I talked to my biology professor about this, and she says that race is not biological, that it's just something that sociologists study or anthropology might study, but it's not something
Well,
biology
that's
should really.
that's that's silly because anthropologists are the ones who pioneered the arguments that race doesn't exist. But what it comes down to is, okay, race is biological in the sense that it does describe biological differences. You can say that race isn't a good categorization scheme. You can say it's arbitrary and that there's plenty of reasons to use a different one. That's fine, but race still describes real differences and can be studied on that regard. Um, in fact, biology textbooks are actually being criticized for now including the term race more and more. And also, if you just swapped out race for population, you have basically the same argument. In fact, there was a guy who wrote a book. I forget his name. It's not coming to me now, but he was going to be republished, and the publisher said, oh, you got to take out the word race. That's no good now. And he just did a word search replace for race and changed it to population. And the book, that was the only change he had to make to the book. So it really is just this taboo about the term race and the fact that race is important in our society for the wrong reasons, I would say, but still important. And actually, like, I mean, are you familiar? You're familiar with the bell curve, I assume, right? The book.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very well.
After the bell curve, there was a. Let me see if I can find it. I'll link it. There was a open letter written by experts on the field of intelligence, and it was signed by people with biology degrees, with genetics degrees, people who were experts in intelligence and allied fields, as Linda Gottfriedson said it. Letter following bell curve. Let me find it. So, I mean, you absolutely can find people who support it. It is What it is just that, it's extremely taboo to do it. I mean, Steven Pinker, he seems to be the only one who's been able to talk about race realism and bell curves and stuff like this without having his career ruined like Charles Murray had. But he's just one example. There's also Richard Plomin. Did I say his name right? Yeah, just Plomin. I'll just say that. I'm not sure if I got his first name right. There's Richard Lynn, although he might be a little taboo. There's Gregory Cochran, Henry Harpending, all kinds of people. And it's just really what it comes down to.
All right. So, is there anything you would like to say to the alt-right crowd?
Don't just be needless dicks, I guess. I mean, some people bring it on themselves and kind of deserve it, but not everyone. Match their intensity. Don't just come in swinging right off the bat. I think we do that too much.
Okay. And what would you say to the people who aren't interested in the alt-right, that don't like the alt-right or might even hate the alt-right?
I would say Sargon and Dr. Lehman had this fun little conversation where they were really impressed with the scholarship at play in the crowd debate. So what I would say is the most high-minded YouTube debate ended with the complete disgrace of the person trying to discredit these ideas. So you can dislike us, that's fine. But these ideas are still around, and you ignore them at your own peril. And yeah, I mean, at some point if you think you can have a cultural civic nationalist order, the burden is on you to prove you can do it. The burden isn't on us to prove you can't. And I think that seems to be missed frequently whenever this debate comes up. That's all I would say.
All right, that sounds good. So I'll leave a link to David Cedarwood's channel in the description below. David, if you would like to advertise yourself, any other links?
I guess my Twitter. Want me to just put it in the side chat, or do you want me to just say it?
You can say it, but
okay. Well, it's at Cedarwooded, as in a wooded meadow, Cedar Wooded. So at Cedarwooded, all lowercase. There's no caps or funny characters.
All right, cool. Well, thanks for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. You asked good questions, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you for tuning in on the Classy Liberal Podcast. If you'd like to receive updates on future podcast episodes, then consider giving me a follow on Twitter. If you like this podcast, then I recommend you check out my YouTube channel. I have other videos on many topics. If you really enjoy the show and would like to support me, then consider becoming a Patreon on my Patreon. Thank you very much.